Welcome back to my coverage of the Zurich 1953 International Chess Tournament. Today, we are moving on to round 7, and in this round, I thought the most instructive game was the game Euwe against Gligoric, because this game really solidified an important principle when it comes to attacking. Now, the game began pretty ordinarily. It was simply the King's Indian, although here g3 was played, and g3 is certainly a move, even nowadays, but it's definitely gotten lower in popularity, and it really spiked in popularity actually around this time, and people really started to enjoy the idea of putting the bishop on this long diagonal. So bishop to g7, bishop to g2, castles, knight to c3, d6, this is all super common, knight to d7, potentially striking in the future with either e5 or c5. The knight is perfectly placed here. We have castles and e5. Now here there's already a couple of ways to play. You can potentially go d5 in this position and try to lock up the structure as white typically does against the King's Indian defense. And here, note that you should never really be worried about e4 because, well, now knight to g5 comes, and you can see the power of this bishop when it gets unleashed. This pawn is basically lost. Rook to e8 is best here, and then white definitely should not fear this position. So d5 was possible. You can also simply take the pawn and kind of clarify the situation in the center, and here just opt for some easy development for your pieces. Or alternatively, you can do what Euwe did here and play e4 and try to get control in the center. And after e takes on d4, knight takes on d4, we reach this very common structure with the pawns where white has a very nice bind on the center squares, the center light squares in the position. And, you know, one nice thing is that c5 here can be met with simply moving the knight, and then there's going to be immense pressure over d6. And so, as opposed to positions where white has a pawn on d4, when black plays c5, white typically locks up the center, and then d6, even though it is weak, it is not really accessible to the white pieces. But in situations like these, c5 would be slightly inaccurate because now d6 comes under heavy fire from potentially both the knight and the queen, and white gets really good play. So because of this, knight to c5 was played instead of c5. Black is trying to still control the center, but rather than with pawns, which would create weaknesses, he does it with his pieces. Here we have the move h3, stopping the development of the bishop perhaps, and also we can see the reason of h3 later on in the game. Rook to e8, we have rook to e1, a5, queen to c2, and now a4. Black is going for this queenside attack, trying to carve out space, especially with the knight here. You can imagine situations where white is forced to weaken their structure. For example, here already a3 would be slightly inaccurate because at some point the knight can now come to b3. It gives black great control over this square over b3. So black is simply trying to create and invoke some weaknesses in the position. Bishop to e3 though, keeping the pawn structure very safe and simply developing. Now c6. And this does create a weakness on d6, sure, but one potential reason that c6 is good here is at some point d5 is an idea, and also the knight can't come to b5, which would be a reasonable move in these positions where the pawn is weak. So if the rook comes to d1, for example, the knight can never jump to b5 and create more pressure on the pawn. So the pawn, even though it is a weakness, it is less important in this position, and we actually do see rook a to d1, but again, the pawn here is harder to access from the white pieces. We have now knight to d7, unleashing this bishop as well, and potentially moving the knight over to e5, where it will be really powerful here, along with this knight, and black will get really good control. Now here we see the move g4, and this was one of the ideas of h3, to set up this idea of g4 and to try to get a very nice bind over the light squares, specifically stopping this idea of f5, maybe in the future also going f4 and f5 from the white pieces and trying to attack on the king side. However, g4 is not as powerful as it is in other positions, and for example, in case you're interested, I can show you an opening against the King's Indian where g4 is much more powerful. And instead of playing g3, let's say we start with knight to c3, and after bishop to g7, we have e4, we have d6, h3, castles, bishop to e3. This is a normal setup with the h3 and bishop e3 system. And one of the key ideas of this h3 system is after e5, we lock up the center, and then when the knight moves somewhere to free up the f-pawn, then we go g4. Now here, this idea of g4 is a lot more powerful, because in both cases, it's stopping f5, or not encouraging f5. It's also in both cases giving the square for the knight, but here the center is locked, which means that playing on the king side will be very, very powerful for white, because black will not be able to get counterplay in the center, and it will take a lot of time for black to try to get counterplay on the queen side. And so this is why g4 is a very powerful move in that position. But if we compare this to what happened in the game, where g3 was played here, we can see that g4 in this position is much less powerful, because of the simple fact that the center is definitely not closed, and there's a lot of tension going on with all of the minor pieces coming in the center. So g4 and this idea of getting the knight to g3 and maybe going and starting to attack is simply not going to work out for white as effective as it would in positions where the center is closed. And this is kind of the principle of attack, which is really universal and general. If the center is locked up, you want to try to attack on one of the sides of the board. But when the center is open, attacking is very double-edged. It's very risky, because while you're attacking on the side of the board, your opponent will continue to put pressure in the center. So queen to a5, doing that, getting the queen out. At some point, maybe the rook comes to the center, and the queen is simply powerful here. This is a nice diagonal. It's doing more than it was doing on d8. It also, of course, maybe is signaling that a3 might come at some point. Now bishop to f1, a very mysterious looking move, but the idea is to meet knight e5 with f4, and now the pawn is defended by the bishop. So knight e5 would not be so powerful here, and so instead a knight to e6 was played. Now the idea of knight to e5 is much more powerful, because after a random move here, let's say a3, knight to e5, and f4 doesn't work because of this nice tactical idea of knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and this fork in the end, where not only are you winning the rook, but better, you're actually just winning a piece here in the center. So because of this, after the move knight to e6, king to g2 was played, stopping any forking ideas on f3, and now h5. And the idea of h5 is to combat the attacking potential of these pawns, and to try to get some space onto the king side for black as well. We have f3, solidifying the pawn structure, takes, and now we have knight to e5, and the knight finally centralizes. Knight to e2, takes, we have a trade, and now d5. And again, white tried to attack on the king side, and black is attacking on the center of the board. Takes. Notice that this nice tactical idea that you might be seeing here of knight takes g4 does not work out here. The point was that now bishop takes d4 seemed like a very strong idea, because if you take with the rook, you hang this rook, and if you take with the bishop, it seems like you're hanging this rook as well, but then suddenly bishop to c3 comes, and indeed white is simply better here. So instead of this, black simply took back in the center, now jumped the knight off to b5, where the knight is more powerful, the rook is unleashed as well. And after takes, the knight comes to d6. Now here there was a nice idea and potential to sacrifice two pieces with knight takes f3 and then bishop takes g4, where the king is just dragged straight into the open, and practically speaking this is much easier to play for black, but also objectively black is totally fine here, because after king to g3 we have check, and then bishop takes d6, and if rook takes, notice there's a fork here. So black will win back some material, and the king is still on f2 really weak here. So instead of this, however, bishop to e6 was played, and you can't really blame black for not going for this tactical resource, because it's super risky. If it doesn't end up working, then you look like an idiot because you sacrifice 2 pieces and the attack doesn't work out. And it's also a very hard attack to calculate because the position changes drastically in these double piece sacrifice, and the king has so many squares that he can go to, it's very hard to calculate all those variations. So bishop e6, a safer option, simply developing, giving away the exchange, but noticing that these pawns on the queen side are really powerful, and actually black can even go for the queen trade here, and black is fine because even though they're down the exchange, they have an extra pawn here, which if mobilized can become incredibly dangerous. Knight to c6, bishop to b6. The bishop here looks really powerful along all these dark squares. Now bishop takes c3, and there was a slight miscalculation because here white thought that rook to e4 simply wins back the pawn, and it certainly seems that way. But now bishop to a5, a very nice tactical idea. You're threatening the bishop, so you can't simply take the pawn, and if bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, which is what happened in the game, well, now the knight defends the pawn. Rook to e5, b6, rook to b5, attacking the pawn, c3, and now rook to c1. Notice that taking the pawn here is possible, but then bishop takes a2, and the rook for black here is easily going to defend this pawn. So all we're doing is trading. So instead of that, rook to c1 immediately was played, and after rook to c8, rook to b4, white realized that taking this a4 pawn is better because it was pushed down the board further. Okay, bishop d5, rook to b4, now knight to b3, and the knight gets super active. We see a repetition of sorts, and then knight to d2, the bishop gets out of the way, and after bishop b3, a really nice sequence of moves here. Rook takes d2, giving back the exchange for a pawn, and after this move, the game was agreed a draw because after bishop takes here, or perhaps even rook takes because the bishop will hang as well, material is basically equal. There's no real targets for either side. This pawn's going to fall in the next couple of moves, and this is a total drawn position. So the biggest takeaway of this game is this failed attack with g4 that never even really got anywhere. The knight never got here, f4 was never played. Why? Because black kept white busy in the center of the board, and that is what tends to happen when you attack in the side of the board when the center is still open and there's a lot of tension. So attacking when the center is open is typically not so good. You try to lock up the center, and then you can go for these risky attacks because black or your opponent will not have as many counterattacking chances in the center. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new around here. Check out the other videos in the Zurich 1953 tournament down below in the description, and I will see you next time. Peace out.